Welcome to Own the Future, a podcast dialoguing with creatives and entrepreneurs to better understand who we are, the work that we do, and how we can shape and own our futures and thereby the future. My name is Skrobot, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Michael Wesch. But you can call him Mike. Mike has his PhD from the University of Virginia, and one thing that you should know about Mike is that in 2007 he created a little YouTube video and sent it to a couple of his colleagues the week before the Super Bowl, and on Super Bowl weekend his video went viral and totally beat out all of the Super Bowl ads. Mike, it is great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks. 2007 sounds like so long ago now. I'm just like saying the words. It's like
it was long ago. It was a lot.
Yeah, back then, for context, I'm tempted to say, there were only like 12 videos on the internet back then. And so going viral wasn't a big deal. But no, there were actually, that was an interesting time because it was just really the dawn of YouTube. And that video I made was also kind of one of the first academic videos that, really had any sort of substance that went viral. So it's an interesting time just to think back, it's only 11 years ago, and yet it seems so long ago. And things were so different.
Yeah, things were very different. It was the dawn of YouTube, as you talked about. What were some of the things that were going through your mind as, you're refreshing the page and you beat out all of the Super Bowl commercials?
Well, obviously there was some like selfish hope that I could like rise to the top. So back then they actually had these really clear metrics of like which videos were the most viral. So these websites you could go to, like Technorati used to keep track of these things, and so I think what was going through my mind was like how interesting it was that I was sitting in this basement on a very cheap laptop that had produced the whole video. So I produced the whole video on this very, very cheap laptop, and I was going up against $1 million productions. And it was really just so emblematic of that moment that I could sit in a basement in Kansas on a farm, in this rural area on this little laptop and actually reach more people than these folks who were spending $1 million on the production, and then furthermore spending $2.6 million on actually putting the video out there on the Super Bowl. So that really sort of signaled that the content of the video was supported by its flourishing, because the content of the video was about how what was called Web 2.0 at that point, how Web 2.0 was changing the landscape of media production and media distribution. And so it was just kind of a neat sort of moment there. Yeah.
Right. Isn't it almost iconic of like a picture of the shift that was happening within culture, that here you're producing material that is kind of more heavy in nature compared to all these Super Bowl ads. And it's you on a farm with zero budget, but yet your content reached more people and beat them even in the metrics in the short run.
Yeah, and it became iconic for quite some time. And I think there were so many of us at that time that thought, wow, this is a harbinger of the future. This is really interesting. And we were really excited, I think there was a lot of hype at that time that the internet was going to transform our culture and transform the way we think, that we were going to move toward sort of deeper material and unleash the masses to let them say what they really wanted to say. We were moving away from a medium that went from the networks to the masses to a very different kind of network.
Right.
And at that time, I think it was nothing but hopefulness. And I actually remember it was just a few months after that video went viral, I was invited to Austria And we had this little get together with about a dozen people, kind of brainstorming, where does this go? What's the future going to look like? And one of those dozen people was Evgeny Morozov, who at that time was running a blogging network in Belarus, and Belarus had this sort of at that time, Evgeny was very intent on enabling this blogging network to talk back to the dictatorship. And the dictatorship was essentially saying, trying to shut down all sorts of free speech and whatnot.
Wow.
So he was being very successful, and he was very excited about how Web 2.0 might change that dynamic. But then over the next few years, what he found was that that dictatorship, as well as many others, were actually using the same tools to propagate misinformation as well as to silence people. And he went the other direction. And if you look at his work today, he made a total flip and is now very pessimistic about the uses of technology in terms of how they could unleash freedom and that kind of thing. He just points out that these things are as much empowering the tyrants as they are any sort of people looking to expand freedom and equality and those kinds of things. So it's we live in interesting times for sure.
And what's your take on it? I mean, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, it did seem like anything was possible. But now looking back, do you feel like the internet and Web 2.0 and now, the Internet of Things, do you think it's changing it for the better and creating deeper connections or deeper content, heavier content? Or do you think, are you a little skeptical?
It's just so, it's just very complex, and it's very different than I expected. I think back then I don't think any of us could have really understood what would happen. And we all knew it would be very disruptive. And it's interesting to see how those disruptions have played out over time. And obviously in ways that people could have never predicted.
Right.
Cultural phenomena is always that way, right? It's always too complex to predict. But just to give you one example in terms of higher education is, because I work in it, is something I think a lot about. And the moment Web 2.0 came on the scene, there was this sense like, oh goodness, this is really going to shake things up in higher ed. If people have free access to really high quality information, Wikipedia was on the rise in 2007.
Yeah.
And there was this sense that, man, if you unleash people to collaborate freely and they can create the world's best encyclopedia, what's to say they're not also going to be able to create the world's best content in all fields?
Absolutely.
So what's the role of a university professor when you have like extraordinary content, that's just it blows away any sort of lecture, that kind of thing. So there were these thoughts of like, okay, what are we going to do? Maybe we need to think more about advising and mentorship. Maybe that's our future role, so that we get the content online, but then we do the sort of hard stuff where we're mentoring people toward higher levels in their fields. And what's interesting is that I think at that time we thought that higher ed would change, and that change would happen inside higher ed somehow. Like university presidents would wake up and be like, oh, let's get on board and change things. And that hasn't happened. And so Here we are 10 years later, 11 years later, and you can look around and you see the same old institutions, and you're like, well, nothing's really changed. But then you look around and you say, wait a minute, like how much education is happening on YouTube right now? Like just
totally.
It's astounding, right? Totally. And so from a wider view, you could start to say like, man, there's definitely some hits being taken to higher ed, and higher ed still isn't really aware of it. And they're going to have to become aware of it very soon. Enrollments have dropped the last 3 years in the United States. They're continuing to drop. I think there's going to be kind of an awakening here where we start to realize that a lot of people are getting what they want out of education in other places. And
do you think that we're in the middle of a tipping point where the scales haven't tipped yet, but the tide has shifted, and higher ed institutions might wake up in 10, 15, 20 years with a rude awakening? Or do
well, I think it's even more sort of interesting than that, in that the forces are already impinging upon us.
Right.
And so there are these like minor sort of adjustments happening. Like my life has changed. For example, I teach more online classes because there's demand for it from students, of course. And it's funny because, I think what's different is, like, while there might have been an expectation that there would be like this guided vision, there is no guided vision. And instead it's lots of individuals making individual choices, sort of adapting to the needs of the time. And there is a sense in which the higher ed of today is already radically different than it was even in 2012. And looking ahead to say 2023 or something like that, I think it's going to be, again, radically different. And yet at no point can you say this is the point where everything changed.
Right.
It's going to be this sort of it'll seem like gradual, and you can't even see it happening. But then if you could just jump between even now 2018 back to 2007, you see radical differences. I actually have some insight into this because I have recorded my lectures, in my classes for quite some time, since 2005. And you can go back to 2005 and you can see a lot of differences between 2005 and 2017. Some of this might be me, but I'm not convinced that it's me. I think it's a cultural shift.
Really?
So some of the changes you'll see is, like, you'll see in 2005, attendance was very high. People tended to show up mostly on time. It was rare that anybody be not on time. And you have to remember, in 2005, at least on our campus, there was no Wi-Fi. Nobody had a smartphone. The iPhone had not been invented yet.
Right.
And so you can just like look down at the students, and it's pretty clear I'm the most interesting thing in the room. I didn't have a lot of competition in 2005. And then while the changes were imperceptible to me year by year, when I look now at my recordings from this past year in 2018, what you see is their attendance is down about, say, 30% or so. This is a room of like 400 people. There are a lot of people coming in late. Much more people coming in late. It's an 8:30 in the morning class, so people are kind of waking up, but a lot more people late than were ever late in 2005. And then they're coming in, and you can look down and you can see, laptops open and cell phones buzzing. Not really buzzing, but you see the notifications sort of flashing on the desk. So it's just a zoo of distraction. The students aren't necessarily paying attention to me. They're on their laptops and they've got, different windows open. They might be shopping, that kind of thing. We live definitely in an age of distraction, and this is we knew it was coming. And I always hoped that I could be that dazzling teacher that could hold their attention. And I think I am a very good teacher, but it still hasn't. I don't know that I'm winning that battle as much as I would like to.
You talk a lot about this in your YouTube content, in some of your lectures, at how during this shift you realized that you needed to do different things as a professor. Mm-hmm. And you talk about how you began shifting from your typical talking head lecture to a different, more interactive style where the students are going out and exploring more and finding their own answers. Is that right?
Yeah. And that's actually started with some, in a way, like some soul searching and research of my own, in which I actually started doing my own assignments, and I started surveying students and taking students out to lunch. And for about a year and a half, I had an open lunch where every day I was eating with a student. And the rule of open lunch with me was no small talk. We would just jump right into like the big stuff and talk about, you know, their hopes and dreams and challenges and barriers and all those types of things. And
What would be your opening question?
uh, my opening, a typical one would be something like, so what are you working on? Like I would say, what are you working on? And, you know, and if they went to a shallow place, I'd be like, no, like, you know, what are you working on? Like on yourself, like where are your shortcomings and who do you hope to be, say in 6 months, if you could be different in some way. And that's where we would start. And that was usually a pretty good opening into what I think of as a real education rather than just, you know, learning a bunch of facts and whatnot. The real education is this transformation of the self. And if the university doesn't profoundly change you in the time that you're here, then we haven't done our job. And so that's where I would always start is just what are you working on?
Right. And so for you yourself, you kind of had that moment in your life. If I get the story correct, you were going to study business administration. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I was just gonna, like a lot of students, you know, you just kind of, you don't really know what is out
Right.
there. You don't know what jobs are available.
I mean, I remember when I went to university and in high school, they give you a list. I'm like, oh, check civil engineering. That sounds great. I didn't even know what it was.
Yeah. I didn't know what engineering was, and I wish I did because I loved like building things, and you know I just didn't see that major on the list. Like, where's the building things major? You know, and
That's great.
So I ended up in business school because I thought, well, I could. It was so naive. The plan was just to like, I'm just going to make a lot of money, and then when I'm 50, I'll figure out what I want to do to be happy.
Gosh.
And it's such a
Classic.
weird idea, right? And so I went to business school, did great in business school. Was by my sophomore year, I had this great internship lined up. I was, you know, fast tracked to success for sure. And then just had this like awakening where I realized I actually dislike everything I'm doing in my classes. Like
What happened in that awakening? What was kind of that trigger?
the trigger was my girlfriend of 2 years breaking up with me. So you never know like what'll trigger these things. But yeah, I mean, it was like this. That was just like reassess everything in your life at this point, right? So because the whole plan at that point, you know, I was with her for 2 years, and you're starting to think like, okay, this is now the plan. I'm gonna stick to it, make lots of money for the next 30 years or whatever, and then go do something else. And that something else, I always envisioned that I would be a teacher, and that was largely just because I had one teacher in particular in high school that just seemed to have it all figured out. I mean, just lived a life of what appeared to me to be like pure joy, you know, and that's what I wanted. And so in that time when I realized I wasn't doing anything I actually enjoyed in business school, and that though I may make a lot of money, I'd be spending my days doing things I didn't enjoy, I just thought, well, you know what? Who cares about money? I'm just going to go be a teacher. And so then I enrolled in the college to be in the College of Education to be a teacher. And then I had to take this anthropology class at the time. It was just sort of like not checking a box of what's called the international overlay. And that's when I fell in love with anthropology and went that route instead.
And so what was it that caused you to fall in love with it? Like, what is about anthropology just makes you resonate and come alive?
So I think I grew up in a really small town in Nebraska, which is a very rural area of the United States. And I just had almost zero interactions with people from other cultures. I shouldn't even say almost zero. I had absolutely zero interactions with people from other cultures. I can't remember a single time from age 0 to 18 that I encountered anybody who spoke a different language. That sounds kind of amazing, but I'm pretty sure that's true. And and very rarely even did I meet anybody who had a different skin color than me. And that's just astonishing to think, but that's how my life was. And so by the time I was, 17 or 18, I was really longing for adventure, longing for
Right.
some way to like feel just to understand the world and uh, to get out there. And so I that's why I went to USC in Los Angeles to go to school, which is obviously a very diverse community. And so I was living in South Central Los Angeles, and everybody was telling me how dangerous it was to live there,
Huh.
and this is at the
Right.
time when there were a bunch of movies coming out about how dangerous South Central LA was. This is the time like there's I think a movie called Boys in the Hood, which is about South Central LA, and I actually lived just a couple stoplights down from where that
Wow.
movie was filmed, and everybody's telling me how dangerous it was, and yet every time I went out on even sort of a simple errand to the grocery store or anything, I didn't find anything but like really interesting and nice people, who were
Totally.
definitely
Totally.
very, very different than what I grew up with. I mean, a lot of these people from a wide variety of different ethnic backgrounds, a lot of them were very poor, but I didn't encounter anybody that was like scary and frightening and threatening and all those kinds of things. And so I actually just started going on longer and longer adventures where I would just, walk out into neighborhoods I was supposedly not supposed to be in and just start talking to people. And uh, I had no idea that there was a job for that, which is anthropology. It was just something I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed going out, meeting people radically different from me, hearing their story. And
And was this experience while you were still in business school or after you had
yeah,
shifted?
I was in business school at the time,
Okay.
and I was just doing this for fun. And I even had like just sort of, I don't know, sort of this random thing where I started going down to it's kind of the Hispanic quarter, you'd say, I guess, in Los Angeles. It's just south of what they call Bunker Hill. There's this area, and there's this uh, old hotel there called the $1 Million Hotel, which was built in the 20s. And it's called the $1 Million Hotel because it cost $1 million to build back then. But it had since been abandoned and nearly condemned, but it had been occupied by poor immigrants and whatnot. And they had essentially squatted on it and kept it from being knocked down.
Wow.
And there was a bunch of kids who lived in that hotel, and they all hung out. And somehow I just kind of fell in with those kids, and I became like some sort of, I don't know, like a leader to them in some way. Me and a couple other friends used to go down there, a few times a week, and we'd find this group of kids. These are all like 8 to 11-year-old kids. And we'd find these kids and we'd just like run around town with them and just have a great time. We were sort of like their big brothers or something,
That's
and
crazy.
and that was just, that became like something I just loved to do. And I loved to like hear their stories and be a part of their lives. And so when I then sort of stumbled into this anthropology class because I had to be there, I was surprised to discover that's exactly what anthropologists do. And they
It
just
was as if things started to click and just kind of like make sense.
yeah. So I was totally on board with being an anthropologist at that point, and I wanted to kind of take it to the next level. Like I was doing these little adventures in Los Angeles, and I was like, I want to do a big adventure in the world. Like, and so I started looking for the place that would be the most different from myself and the most different from where I grew up. And I settled in on the interior of New Guinea, and I started,
It's quite different.
yeah. So I started scheming on how can I get to the middle of New Guinea, to some of these places that are virtually unexplored at that time.
Yeah.
It was a little kind of naive, I think, to think that there could be places completely cut off from the world. But as it turns out, I did find a place that was more or less completely cut off, just not by virtue of like lack of exploration and technology, but I ended up on the border between Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, which
Yeah.
was basically abandoned and not abandoned by the outside world and not really explored and understood very well, because, you know, on the Papua New Guinea side, they didn't want to offend the Indonesians. Indonesians didn't want to offend Papua New Guinea and their allies and whatnot. So that border area was pretty much left alone as kind of a no man's land, and that's where I ended up going, because it was just my interest at the time to be at a place that was kind of as removed from Western society as possible, I guess.
Now, when you were taking this leap from studying business and living the American dream to becoming an anthropologist and a teacher and traveling to Papua New Guinea, where cannibalism was outlawed in the 1960s, did you get resistance from family, from friends, or even yourself? Or was it just like a no-brainer and everyone was like, this is a great idea?
No, my parents have always been really supportive of everything that I've ever wanted to do, at least openly to me. You know, looking back on it, I know they had a lot of reservations, not only about this idea, but other ideas I had before that. But, you know, good for them. They never said anything.
That's amazing.
Never tried. I mean, I was, from one example is like at one point, and this is not even, you know, I was like pretty far into school. I was maybe 20 years old. I was entertaining the idea of being a rock star. And I mean, that's just a terrible idea. I had no chance of being a rock star.
You do have a couple, you know, viral videos, so yeah. it might happen.
Yeah. No, but I'm a terrible singer. And I remember I'd actually like play songs for my parents and I would sing for them. And they had to be sitting there thinking like, oh my gosh, this is such a bad idea, you know? And yet they never said anything, and they were always encouraging. So, pretty amazing.
Wow.
Parents in that way. So yeah, nobody was against it. Later, they told me how scared they were that I was going to New Guinea. But they were super supportive. And in fact, after I'd gone to New Guinea several times over the course of several years, and then I was living there for a whole year, and my wife was there as well. My mom actually came to New Guinea, and that was my mom's first time out of the country, other than she'd gone to Canada once. But
what an experience.
Yeah. So to like get on a plane and find her way all the way to this little village in the middle of New Guinea. It's an epic trek to make, you know,
absolutely,
it's about 2 weeks on planes, you know, and a lot of them are like little, small planes that, you know, over the mountains and whatnot, and waiting around in little mountain villages for the next plane. It's pretty amazing that she did that.
Wow. That is brave.
Yeah.
That is really brave. Yeah. We actually lived in Papua New Guinea the same years. We were there from 96 to 2003.
Oh, nice.
So we overlapped.
Yeah. Where were you at?
We were in Eastern Highlands province.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you
Highlands. My dad was actually a pilot flying some of those bush planes around.
Man. So I might have flown with your dad then.
It's possible.
Because I flew out of Goroka to Karamui once, in that time. And there's not a lot of planes in that area. So, you know, if your dad was flying Goroka, then I probably flew with him.
He flew everywhere. So, you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of airstrips. So you never know. Now, when you were in Papua New Guinea, you were studying how new media impacts culture. And what were some of the things that you observed or learned, or can you shed some light on that?
Yeah. So it was by accident that I studied it. Sometimes you go to a village and you don't really know what's going to be relevant and interesting, but you just want to as an anthropologist, you want to convey the story as truthfully and carefully as possible. So you may go in there wanting to study one thing. And in particular, I wanted to study culture change and how I thought it was going to be about how the new school, they just put in a new school and a new health clinic and a new church. So I was kind of curious, these institutions seem to represent mind, body, and spirit in the Western sense, you know, the mind being the school, the body being the health clinic, and the spirit being the church. And so how do these sort of Western institutions come into this place, and how do they change the way people think about themselves? And what happened was that while I was there, sort of a new institution emerged, which I didn't expect to come, and that was, it seems really simple, but it was the census. And what that meant was that these local folks who had learned to read and write, and there were only about 10 of them at the time. So there were like 2,000 people in this region, and 10 people know how to read and write, and they're in charge of doing the census. And so they go around village to village. It's about 3-day walk to the most distant villages, and I walked with them, and we would just go around, and you would think this would be really simple. All you have to do is list people's name in a census book, and they'd go and they just start asking people for their names, and it was really tough because they'd hear, for example, so they go to a village, and somebody would say their name was Awim, and at first they'd write Awim, and then they'd be like, the next person they'd ask, and they say their name's Awim, and it turns out Awim just means taboo, and what they were saying was essentially, I can't tell you what my name is, or to me, like our relationship is taboo, essentially. So they would say taboo.
Right.
And in fact, what happened was that, and they knew this going in, but I didn't, and so it was revelation to me, was that a lot of people did not yet have a name. They had basically it's kind of interesting. Think about how different the world can be if you live in a place like this that's entirely non-literate. It's a place where everybody you see on a day-to-day basis, you already know, and you have a relationship with that person, and you tend to speak to that person with the name of the relationship, the same way that you might, you go home and you call your mom and your dad. Imagine that if you had, say, a few dozen terms for different relationships, and so you would use those, and so they'd be things, right. Sister. And one of the big categories is taboo. It just means like you and I cannot marry. That's basically what it means. And so when these census guys were going through, they would say, "What's your name?" And they would say taboo. And then
because the names would be different for different relationships. Yeah, so you and I would have a different name between each other than I would have with my children.
Right. And so that same person who's named taboo to you is named mom to somebody else, and is named grandma to somebody else, and so on. And so eventually they just had people invent census names for the book, and they would actually call these census names, like they would use the English word census name. And so essentially, if you were listening to them doing the census and you didn't speak the language, what you would hear is a bunch of gibberish that you don't understand, and then the word census name. So it's like blah 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 census name, and then the person would say their name, and so that was just like an interesting little thing, right? But it struck me like, oh, isn't that interesting? These people don't even have like a categorical name, and I just kind of put it in the back of my mind, like, okay, that's interesting. Like, does that mean that then they don't also have a stronger sense of individualism like we do? Like, how important is it to have a categorical identity, like a name that you hang everything else on, in terms of who you are? And so that was the first thing. And then over time, there were a bunch of other like little things that made me realize how important media was in shaping our identity, and not just like media in terms of how we think of it today, like, like television and internet and cell phones and smartphones and so on, but even like media, like as simple as the written word. And
right.
So really my study there was about the effects of writing on how people thought about themselves and how the society worked. And what was, so just to follow through with that census thing, what ends up happening is that these people are doing the census. It's a big struggle to get the names down. And then they get very frustrated because they had done a census like, maybe 10 years before that, and everybody had moved around since then. And everybody lives in these villages. Like there's, dozens and dozens of villages scattered all over the landscape, and they're moving all the time. And so they have these old maps and old censuses from 10 years ago, and they don't match with anything. And so they start getting really angry, and they basically start saying, you guys need to move into 8 villages to match what's in the census book, because the census book had 8 villages in it. And,
Really?
And they actually started forcing people to move into these villages. And not only forcing them, but actually going around and burning houses and forcing them to move to these villages. And this was powered by a lot of other things. You start to see that the state is actually running things through the book, and the limitations of the book are shaping how things are ran on the ground. So the fact that it's actually pretty hard for a book to keep up with a semi-nomadic culture in which people are moving every 3 years made it that these, sort of keepers of the book were getting angry and saying, why do you have to keep moving? It's making my bookkeeping impossible, And they basically said,
Classic.
yeah, so they're like, you guys need to move into these 8 villages. And then it went a step further. They started burning houses, and it wasn't just them. It was all the locals were really excited about this, because the way the state apparatus works through the book is they have these formulas, which is essentially number of people in a village times a certain number of monetary value equals the amount of support you get for your village. And if that number, goes past a certain point, then you get an aid post, you get medicine in your village. If it goes past another point, you get a school. And if it's past a certain point, the missions start to see you. There's actually the only way you can make yourself visible to the state is by having a large village in a static place with a large number of people on the census roll. That's how the state sees you. And they started to think, gosh, the state doesn't see us if we live in these little villages that are moving every 3 years. So all the local people really started getting excited about this idea of moving into larger villages. And they started burning their own houses in some cases and moving into these larger villages with the goal of making sure every village had more than 200 people, because then that makes it seen by the state. So that was like my research there. And what ended up happening was that the very reason why people live in sort of more remote areas in smaller groups started to rear its head and sort of strike back against this state logic. And what it is that there's this sort of overwhelming sharing logic, which you probably saw when you were in New Guinea. And that is that if you have something and you're showing it, it needs to be shared. Like there's no like flaunting wealth or anything like that. You can flaunt gift giving, right? Like it's cool if you want to like bring stuff out and make a big show of giving a big gift, but you don't like just flaunt your wealth and not share it with other people. And so
it's the one talk system.
Yeah. And so these small villages were kind of an adaptation to that, where it's kind of easy to keep that kind of sharing relation with up to say 50 people. But you get beyond that and people start to feel slighted, and there's jealousies, and it's really hard to make like if you do have like a sort of a banner day where you go out and you actually succeed in the pig hunt and you come home with a wild boar, it's pretty easy to satisfy 50 people. But if it's more than that, people feel slighted and all that kind of stuff. So these smaller places were really kind of an adaptation to all of that. And they were also a cultural or an environmental adaptation, because when you go through like a tough time, like a drought or something like that, it's kind of nice to be spread out through the landscape in a way that that the gardens produce enough to get you through a hard time like that. When you live in a condensed area, you sometimes have to walk up to say 7 miles or so to get to all of your garden area. If you have like 300 people in one area, it just gets to be a lot harder to produce enough within a small area for 300 people. So there were a lot of adaptations to that, and those things started to kind of wear on people. And within that year, it was really just total chaos. There were rampant witchcraft accusations, and these people trying to live in basically a bunch of people trying to live together that had never really succeeded in living together before found that they really couldn't live together. And
did the system end up breaking
totally
down?
broke down. And so by the end of it, it started with 8 villages of say 200 people each. And or to go back even farther, it's probably about 45 villages, 50 people each, condensed into 8 villages of over 200 people each. And then afterwards, it was even more than 45 villages because people were just, in fact, it almost went down to the household where people were just kind of disappearing into the bush, so to speak, to live in garden houses and just be away from everybody for a while. Just everybody had to like kind of calm down. They just couldn't
take a little time out.
It was kind of a big timeout. And after a few years, it probably just about a year or so, like things kind of went back to normal and settled down, but there was no new plans to create these large villages again.
Wow. I think that's an amazing picture of, the rural moving to urban settings and the systems that are then built into place, which attract more people and cause more systems, which then cause more problems. But you also talk about how, and you mentioned this, how media or technology, when new media or new technology is introduced into a system or into a society, relationships change. And so you did some preliminary work in Papua New Guinea, but now most of your work has been in digital ethnographies, looking at how digital platforms, how Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Web 2.0 is changing and mitigating relationships. Can you talk to how that influx of media is shifting global culture today?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to like paint a broad picture of how it's shaping global culture. And I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear, your observations there in Dubai and how it's different than what we see here in the US. I mean, most of my studies over the last 10 years have been among college students on a campus in the middle of the United States. And there are going to be cultural differences there. So I can say quite a bit about what it looks like here. But I think it would be really interesting to look more broadly at, how it looks elsewhere. And there's a lot of really interesting studies out there showing how these things look very different in different cultural environments. I mean, the main thing, the big insight, the core thing to start with is just this simple idea that this idea that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. This is an old idea, sometimes credited to Marshall McLuhan, and sort of this, what you might call the media ecologists. Media ecologists are people who want to look at the media landscape in the same way that you'd look at the environment. And the way we look at the environment is through an ecological perspective, where it's this really complex system in which lots of different little things affect lots of other little things. And so a media ecology perspective demands that you take a sort of a complex view of things. But there are some really simple rules that you can identify, and think about when as a new technology enters a culture. So for one, technologies are not unbiased in themselves. Like, they actually have inherent biases in the form that they take. So a medium will actually shape what can be said, how it can be said, who can say it, who can hear it, how messages will be accessed in the future, and so on. And the easiest way to see this is to compare two radically different media forms. So for example, smoke signals are going to be very different than books or Instagram, and you can just, there's certain things you can't say through smoke signals that you can say in a book. And it kind of goes the other way as well. There are certain advantages to smoke signals in certain situations. You can't hurl a book 7 miles, but you can see a smoke signal over 7 miles, that kind of thing. So simple idea, it affects what can be said, who can say it, who can hear it, that kind of thing. But then you then have to realize this is happening in a social environment. It's not just about one person and what they can say and do with the technology. It's a social world. And so then you also have to consider what kind of collaboration it enables, what kind of knowledge does it prioritize and bring to the surface. And this becomes like really important in today's times when you're looking at today's media landscape. One of the dominant features of the media landscape today is the algorithms being tuned toward grabbing your attention. And what grabs your attention are a lot of sort of, in a way, we're creating this clickbait that is driven towards sensationalism, imagery, and that imagery might be shocking or surprising or even sort of semi-pornographic, that kind of thing. This sort of clickbait world that we've created, where you get essentially 6 words in an image to grab somebody's attention, is driving the kind of knowledge that's being spread. And that just gets
which is almost opposite to what you saw back in 2007.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really honestly, it's strange to say, but from I don't know, and maybe it's not, I'd have to really think about this, but there are certainly some ways in which the environment of 2007 online was preferable to the environment we have today. I would qualify that in some sense because there are some things about today that are quite amazing and really, I think, good. The quality of, for example, the quality of, the quality of entertainment's a lot better. So some people call this the age of peak TV, that we've, so for better or worse, Netflix is amazing. They produce really high quality content, and you can take that even to the area of, say, knowledge production, which is something I care a lot about. The documentaries on Netflix are amazing and very well done. And not only that, but a lot of this stuff is free on YouTube. There are a lot of really great YouTube creators creating very good content that's very useful. The amount of knowledge you can absorb on YouTube is just absolutely astonishing, and way better than
it's my primary search engine right now, even for my kids. It's well, let's go to YouTube and find out.
Yeah, I'm the same way, and it's been quite a revolution, really, in the way that I do work. I'm surprised in a way that I've gone that direction, but I would have never thought that even 5 years ago. But YouTube is just there's an astonishing number of very, very good creators.
Yeah.
So it also makes it interesting then from a content creator standpoint. The market for being a content creator is in a way really great. Like, more people can be content creators than ever, but the price or the pay for being a content creator is being driven down simply by the number of content creators that are out there and the quality that they're producing. So that, you're a good content creator is now putting out, in many cases, spending $20,000 to $30,000 just in capital to have the right equipment, to have the good lenses and the good cameras and the good editing suite and everything else. And then they're producing content hoping to remake that money. And I would be very curious. I've been wanting to do a research project on this, and maybe I'll start one here in the next year, but I'm very curious to see what percentage of content creators, for example, who start off with the big dreams are actually making it. I think we're looking at an era of, you've probably seen some of the economists writing about this, about sort of like this idea of a superstar economy, where anywhere where you have sort of this type of environment where certain conditions are met that allow for a lot of people to enter a market and produce material, but only a few of them will ultimately be sort of rise to the top.
Yeah.
So those superstars will get paid very, very well and make millions and millions of dollars, and others will not. And so on YouTube, you're seeing that right now. I think you're seeing like the Casey Neistats and people like that are making probably tens of millions of dollars at this point. The guys at Dude Perfect are probably making tens of millions. And then,
Yeah.
you know, everybody else, like that's definitely like a hockey stick graph where there's a bunch of people making millions,
For sure.
and then there's a bunch of people
For
not making
sure.
anything, you know. And that hockey stick graph in terms of economics, so back to the effects of media and technology, that's actually a really important point to be made, is that these things, you know, technologies enter the environment, they start changing things, and ultimately they do have really profound economic effects. They have these social effects, economic effects, they'll have political effects, and at the highest level, they ultimately even have an effect on how we think about ourselves. So our ideas and ideals actually shift over time, and those are the things you can't see in the moment, because we're all kind of in the water of that stuff, right? The environment is immersive, so you can't really see outside of it. But every once in a while, you can get a little glimpse of it. And whether that's like the example I gave earlier, where I can actually look at my video of me lecturing in 2005 versus 2012 and see like, or 2017 and be like, wow, this is different. Or sometimes you just, you know, if you can immerse yourself back in a moment in, say, the early 90s before the internet really took off, then it's all of a sudden like, oh, wow, holy, you know, geez, like a lot of things have changed. You know, gosh, we had travel agents in the early 90s, you know, and then,
Right.
and all that kind of thing. And you start to realize just how quickly this stuff can shift.
I think, you know, to your point, here in the Middle East, in Oman and the UAE, 45 years ago, I think there was one school and one hospital, maybe only a few kilometers of paved roads. And over the last 40 years, governments, due to oil, have poured billions and billions of dollars into infrastructure. And now there's free education, there's free healthcare, there's, you know, everywhere you have paved roads, there's civilization has seemingly bloomed overnight. And with it is, of course, you know, new media today. And I find it, I'm very curious. I don't necessarily have answers, and I understand you probably don't either. As an anthropologist, you'd have to get into the mix of it and really understand. But there's a massive shift that I'm seeing kind of from afar, and thinking, you know, the grandparents and even parents of this generation here in the Middle East, they didn't even grow up with what our parents might have grown up with. They were by and large uneducated. And all of a sudden, it's as if overnight we have a dawn of new media, of cell phones, of Instagram, of connectivity. When technologies like that enter a society, what are some of the typical trends that we might see? And what are some of the questions that you might pose to young people who are trying to navigate a new culture? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, without being there, it'd be hard. But I think one thing that's surprising about a lot of the research on these types of things is just how quickly it's normalized for young people, especially. So you don't typically get very far in asking young people, if you're looking for insights from young people about how different things are now. And obviously that's because they didn't actually, you know, live through this past. And the past can, that even when it's that different, can start to seem so distant, so quickly that people almost forget what it was like.
Right.
I mean, I was just in Vietnam, and you know, about over half the population is under the age of 26 there, and they have lived only in a time of economic boom. So like anybody under the age of 26 doesn't remember, of course they don't remember the Vietnam War. They don't remember sort of this age of strict communism that went, through the 80s. And all they've ever seen is the result of the sort of massive reforms toward a free market. And so there is this remarkable sort of forgetting that happens so quickly. I think that's kind of the surprising thing, because as an anthropologist, I think what we're always looking for is like, well, how have these traditions of the past actually shaped the present? And I'm actually consistently surprised at how quickly some traditions of the past can disappear. But on the other hand, there's some that are pretty persistent, and that's what makes the study of different technologies in different cultural environments very interesting. Are these cultural differences, and that's where, without being there, I couldn't really say much about that. But certainly, even if you look at, I have one of my best friends right now, grew up in India, and he's going through an arranged marriage process right now. So he's like 29 years old and going through an arranged marriage thing. And of course, the arranged marriages in India are all now facilitated through apps and online dating stuff, and it's really fascinating to see like how the technology, like you could say on the one hand, you could hypothesize that these technologies would essentially usher in an age of individualism and ultimately like get rid of this notion that we should have arranged marriages. But people, a lot of Indian families like just have such a, like their entire experience is shaped around their families and extended families, and there's such a rich vibrancy of life around that they can't even imagine not having some kind of arranged marriage, which would facilitate
Totally.
The bringing together of families. It's not about bringing together two individuals, it's about these two families coming together. So that's where you see like this persistence, and then the technology working in a very different way, and again,
and them reshaping the tools
exactly,
to meet their culture rather than the tools shaping their culture.
Right. And so, and I had one of my graduate students was working on a project in Bangladesh where he's working, with Facebook, and this challenge of how should you create the Facebook timeline and feed and profile and all that stuff in Bangladesh, where the norm is for many people to share the same profile. And this has to do somewhat with poverty and access, not, people only have intermittent access to a thing, but it also has to do with how they're thinking about themselves, and how, for them, they may want to represent themselves not as an individual, but actually as, sort of a kin network or something. Right. And one kin network wants to check in on another kin network, and gosh, it's kind of a hassle to, look for an individual profile and then look for another individual's profile, so he's been kind of thinking about what all that means, also in terms of privacy and all that kind of stuff. Like, it influences all the way down to what's the login scenario going to be when it's multiple people sharing an account and all that kind of stuff. So different cultures kind of push back on our technologies in different ways. And I think one of the things that my student in Bangladesh discovered was just how deep the sort of American individualism assumptions permeate Facebook, right down to like the fine print in the terms of use and everything. So that was a real eye opener for me. All kinds of cultural assumptions are built into the technologies, and then they go out in the world, and the technologies are very quickly transformed by other people, so that sometimes, the creator thought they were creating one thing and it turns out to be something very different.
That's a great point and a segue to our final question, which is you talk about the three big questions that in the last 150 years we have all of a sudden been asking. Can you touch on those questions? And do you think it's just a Western society that's asking these questions, or do you think it's something more on a global scale?
Uh, so so the so basically, this came out of my work in New Guinea and then other places in the world, uh, where you start to realize that basically the main questions that have driven me my entire life and that drive most of the people around me and that drive my students are not the same questions that are driving, say, my friends in New Guinea or other people around the world. And those questions are, who am I? What am I going to do? Am I going to make it? So those three questions represent like three really big domains of life, like the domain of identity, like who am I, like what do I stand for, that kind of thing. The second one is more about occupation and actually making a living. You know, what am I going to do, which can also have a moral dimension, of course. And then the third one, am I going to make it, is this constant concern of risk and doubt that permeates our worlds. And so I I bet it's really hard to find anybody in, well, we'll start with Western society for now. Like, I bet it would be hard to find anybody in Western society who isn't asking those questions, even far along in their career. And the reason being, like, because the third question is still always in doubt because the world is constantly changing so fast. Uh, so I am sitting here as a tenured professor, a full professor. You know, I've made it to the top of the mountain, so to speak, and I still can't stop asking that question: am I going to make it? Because I honestly don't know that the university will exist the way it does now in 2 years or 3 years. Um, I'm pretty secure I'll
Wow.
be paid for the next 2 years, but I don't know after that. I really can't know. And so, so then you're still asking the other two questions too, like, you know, what am I going to do? And, you know, so for me, like I'm hedging my bets, you know, like I'm making sure that I'm prepared to be something other than an anthropology professor if needed, you know? So I'm always thinking about that kind of stuff. And then the first question, who am I, is of course deeply shaping of like what you're going to do and those kinds of things. So my
Yeah.
students are constantly asking these questions. They're definitely the questions that are rattling around as they're trying to figure out what their major is going to be and all that kind of stuff. And then I think the bigger question is like, is this happening elsewhere? I think that this is a question that's going to emerge in any complex society that has moved away from kinship and community as the primary safety net and move toward government and markets.
Yeah.
This is like kind of the big transition in the entire world that transcends even um, culture in a way, right? This is bigger than just culture. This is about, because regardless of what sort of cultural values and whatnot are behind all these things, there is a very massive shift away from kinship and community toward the state and markets to
Yeah.
sort of so to be the primary, you know, operation in a society. So as you move toward the state and markets, you do move into a world of insecurity, but also obviously it's a world of freedom and flourishing. And um, very few people who are, you know, very few of us who are in this. I think we lament the loss of kinship and community, and we try to like restore it however we can, and try to maintain it however we can. But we also don't want to go back to an age in which our families would dictate to us what we were going to do, even though that would be wonderfully secure, right? To like just have somebody tell you that you're going to
Right.
do what I did for a living. You know, you're going to, you know, that would be really nice. But I think we like the freedom to choose. Um, and we like, there's a lot of other things that go along with that are deeply, um, And these are, again, still like there are a lot of cultural battles being fought about this all over the world, but some of these things have to do with justice and morality and all that kind of stuff. Like, do we turn to community and kinship and tradition for our values, or are we going to move toward values that are based on larger principles that are based in larger complex societies and so on? This is a really messy, difficult set of questions.
Yeah.
And they certainly do vary across cultures. But yeah, but I do think that those three questions are pretty dominant in the lives of many people across cultures, even though the sort of environment can look different in different situations.
The community that I'm connected to here, there's a lot of creatives and entrepreneurs who have kind of bucked the 9 to 5, who have said no to the government job. 60% of males coming out of university get government jobs rather than going into the private sector. And the relationships that I have are mostly people who have said, I'm going to do something that's creative. I'm going to do something that's risky. I'm going to start my own business and find my own way. In light of these three questions that I think they are asking, I know I'm asking, I think society is asking, what advice would you give to them? What questions would you give to them to help them navigate, or is there a way to navigate these questions in a time of political uncertainty, of economic uncertainty, of even tech uncertainty? Things are shifting so quickly. What would be some of the things that you would say to them?
I think in today's world, I know this is going to sound strange, but I think I'm going to just say that I think a 5-year plan might be a bad idea. Just to give you one example, I think that you're better served by really figuring out kind of who you are, what your goals are, and then passionately pursuing short-term goals that might take you someplace that you just can't even imagine right now. I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs try to kind of develop something that takes, several years to develop. And the problem is, by the time they develop it, they're, 3 years behind the curve. It's really kind of heartbreaking, that to see somebody put so many years of their life into something only to see that somebody else did it a few years before. And in this superstar economy, the early people get it, get all the traction and whatnot. So, but I think there's something to be said for like working really hard on something that you can see that there is like a clear outcome for it, even within, say, like a 3-month horizon or something like that. And, you work really hard on something like that, or even something that even has like even something like right now, today, like just take whatever it is in front of you today and just like knock it out of the park. Just do something really, really well today. Those things somehow sort of all accumulate and end up paying off. So that, a lot of the success I've had has all been from just being super passionate and excited about whatever it is I'm doing at the moment. And as it turns out, that ends up being practice for something down the road that I didn't even realize would be important. So just, a couple examples would be,
Absolutely.
One was I've always had a passion for video editing since like 2001 when I made my first little video. And that was all like kind of a private affair, like I just made little videos for my family about little things, but I just loved doing it. And so I do it almost every day. And I started teaching, and I brought that same passion to my teaching. So I would make several videos for every class period. So there I was making, 3 or 4 videos a day. And then really the first video I ever put up on YouTube, the only reason I put it up on YouTube was because I needed an easy way to send it to 4 friends so they could check my work on it. And that was The Machine Is Using Us, which went on to have like, 12 million views and completely changed my life. And then along with that,
Wow.
I was super passionate about teaching all this time, right? So I was putting so much effort into teaching. And what's the payoff for that? Really nothing. Like people talk about this all the time. In higher ed, you do not get promoted for being a great teacher. You get promoted for being a great researcher. But I just loved teaching. And so I put everything. I put my entire heart and soul and time into every lecture I did. And it was really only for, sometimes a few dozen people in the room. But when that video went viral, I'm suddenly getting called to like come give a keynote at this place or that place. And, at first it was just a few hundred people. But I was so practiced in giving talks and teaching that people, it resonated with people. And pretty soon I was giving talks to thousands of people, and it was all just this passionate pursuit of what was right in front of me, which was in a way meaningless, right? I mean, it actually had no effect that I could see on my future well-being. I never imagined that I would make videos or give talks in front of thousands of people and make, a lot of money doing that. I just didn't see that as a possibility. I only loved it, and I just did it. So yeah, I just think people should just pay attention to like what's right in front of them, especially those things that they really love to do, those things that they can't not do, and just do those things. And the universe, I think, gives back immediately when you do that. So that in the reality is that whatever money I made from all this was pretty meaningless. I actually, as long as I can make a living, right? I mean, that's you want to like at least do that much. And I know that's like scary, and that's part of the risk is like, what if you don't make anything, like you can't even like pay your hospital bills or even get enough food, that kind of thing. Those are real risk. But beyond that, like if you can at least get that much out of it and you're loving what you're doing, you really don't need anything else. I find it surprising in a way that, when I'm really, really doing the things that I love, which happen to be like making videos and preparing talks and thinking about big issues and ways to talk about those big issues, I find that I really just don't need anything. It comes around like, like in the US, we have like these, we're a very materialistic society, obviously, right? So we have these birthdays where you're supposed to like give people things, and then Christmas where it's just like a flurry of presents.
Yeah.
And you're just like, gosh, like when you're doing what you love, like you don't need anything. Like, what do I need? Like, I don't need anything. I just, the only things I need are, sometimes I need, a new pair of running shoes because I like to run and then they wear out, but I don't really, I think there is just an instant, the universe instantly gives back when you're doing what you love, because, you're just filled with the joy of doing what you love. So
I love that. I think, even hearing some more of your story, I think of your parents and how they knew you were horrible at singing and at piano, but they encouraged that passion to learn and that passion to give yourself to something. And even in hearing how you treat your students, you're encouraging them to learn, to give themselves to something, whether it's creating board games, whether it's creating music, whether it's creating videos. You're encouraging them to be passionate about something and to become passionate, lifelong learners, rather than trying to check all the boxes. And that if you're passionate about learning and you're passionate about giving yourself to whatever it is, that in the long run, it will be like laying bricks and it will pay off. Is that right?
Yeah. And I'll even go a step further. And that is, I think one of the things that could really bring somebody down is like they could look around and be like, dang, I'm not passionate about anything. Well, in that case, like the proper road forward is actually just to practice being passionate. It really is kind of like I don't know, it's like an attitude you can take to the world, and it's something you can practice every moment of the day.
How do you
And
practice being passionate?
well, there are a lot of different factors. So there's actually sort of a neuroscience to this, in the sense that your brain sees passion essentially as dopamine, and dopamine is released when you are pursuing something and there is a hope of succeeding. That's when your dopamine's like really flowing. If you're pursuing something and there's very little hope, you don't get the dopamine. In fact, you get the opposite. You get all sorts of stress hormones and whatnot. And so what you need to do, of course, there's a lot of there's a lot of research into this stuff, but essentially you're looking for that zone of what's called the zone of proximal development in educational terms. You need that thing that's just challenging enough that it's very challenging, and yet it's not so challenging that it's hopeless.
Wow.
And when you're pursuing something in that realm, you just get you get the sense of flow. You get that rush of dopamine. There are a lot of other things that can like disrupt your entire brain chemistry in terms of dopamine. And a lot of those things are being damaged by the media environment we live in today. So the little hits of dopamine you get by searching through your Facebook feed or posting something and waiting for those likes to come and all that kind of stuff. Or even like short-term pleasures, like indulging in any sort of like, even like indulging in like bad foods that are bad for you, that kind of thing, or indulging in like viewing pornography, anything like that. Those are all shown in research that they kind of create a dysfunctional stress circuit to where dopamine isn't flowing in optimal ways. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking hits of dopamine, and your brain gets really used to those hits of dopamine, and it kind of numbs to those things. And because you're now numb to what is really what biologists call supernormal stimuli, like a donut is a supernormal stimuli. There's nothing in our evolutionary past that is as sweet and fatty as a donut. And
right.
And so it's a supernormal stimuli. We love things that are sweet and fatty because in our past we needed calories. But now the donut is like a supernormal stimuli, and essentially our brains adapt to that. And if you eat lots of donuts, you kind of get bored by everything else, And the same thing can be said in any other domain. And so I actually, this is going to be strange, but one of the ways I try to nurture passion in my life is by not indulging in things that are what I consider supernormal stimuli. I try to immerse myself in just the everyday pleasures of everyday life, like a simple walk out in the outside, and like just paying attention and being grateful for what's around me. It sounds so simple, but by indulging in these very simple pleasures that are actually around me all the time, and that I can pretty much count on being there all the time, you kind of adapt to those things, and you get kind of this more steady flow of dopamine.
So to break those kind of super dopamine, like a donut, it would be to detox from those things, to detox from your feed, and to just get out face to face in nature. And is that kind of like the first step to develop passions?
I think that's a baseline. And then the second thing is you just constantly find ways to be passionate about what it is in front of you. So most of us have had to go through many years of working for somebody else, or even just going through school or something like that, where you're doing something that somebody told you to do. And somehow you have to flip that and take ownership of it and turn that have to into a want to. You have to change it into something you want to do. And that's a really great way to nurture passion, is just to just take anything in your life, especially those things that you don't want to do, and find a way that you want to do them. And what I found in my own life is that as you do that, it becomes more and more automatic, so that over time you actually become passionate about whatever's in front of you. And one of my students illustrated this really brilliantly. I think he came out of school, had no idea what he wanted to do, was really struggling with the passion question, really struggling with like, what is my passion? I don't know what my passion is. And so in the meantime, he just took a job at a coffee shop. And what he decided to do was just become passionate about coffee. You know, here he is like at a coffee shop, might as well be passionate about it while he's there. And so he learned everything he could about brewing coffee from the picking the beans all the way to like processing and creating the coffee to the actual presentation of the coffee. He paid attention to everything and he became passionate about everything. And within a few years, he was actually in these sort of like, I didn't even know this existed, but he was like in the regional finals for coffee brewers, you know, like he was becoming a world-class coffee brewer. Wow. And because of that, you know, he was getting noticed, and he then ran into this guy who was a filmmaker, and they started talking, and they just kind of hit it off. And while he was talking to the filmmaker, he told the filmmaker, you know, I've always wanted to make films, you know, and they just teamed up and they started making films together. And they walked into a public television station in Kansas City and got $1 million grant to create a series of videos about people trying to live the American dream from different places in the world. So it was like this dream project that came to fruition for him. And it really came about, I think, not because he followed his passion, but because he nurtured passion itself. Yeah. You know, and became this passionate guy. You know, it
like creates a virtuous cycle, a ratchet, where you kind of start on this path and all of a sudden doors start to open up. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny how this stuff, you know, this stuff is timeless in a way. I mean, I study different cultures around the world. And part of that is I'm very interested in different wisdom traditions around the world. Like I don't just stick to like the, you know, 7 world religions that people typically know about. Like I'm really interested in sort of wisdom traditions everywhere. And one of the things you keep seeing emerging in wisdom traditions everywhere is this idea that at every moment of your life, there's a decision to be made, and one road leads toward long-term joy and the other one leads towards short-term happiness. And there's this distinction in a way between joy and happiness, and that, and so the short-term happiness is, you know, have a donut or whatever it is, right? The long-term joy is, you know, watch what you eat and go for a run. You know, that kind of thing.
Powerful. I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. Well, I want to thank you for your time. You've been so generous. And 2 things to close. One, you have a online course that's free. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Where can people find that?
Yeah, that's at anth101.com. It's ANTH101.com. It's just a introduction to cultural anthropology broken up into the 10 big ideas that are kind of the main core of what you can discover when you study all humans in all times and all places, which is the study of anthropology. And then along with those 10 big ideas, we have 10 challenges that allow you to live your way into this new way of thinking with these big ideas. So just for one of the examples that I really love is like the 3rd big idea is that humans are unique in the animal world as creatures that are constantly trying new things, and that kind of has a double sword to it. Like we basically live not through instinct but through habit, and when we try new things, we're essentially potentially breaking out of a habit and creating new ones. And so the challenge associated with that big idea is then to take 28 days and try something new and try to build a new habit or try to break an old habit. So it's that kind of thing. It's very interactive and fun, and also at times very deep and challenging. So I love teaching the class. It's free and open. We put everything up online.
It seems like that course is almost kind of a self-help, hold you by the hand if you're struggling with developing passions in your own life. It almost is like a Kickstarter to help develop those things. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, then it's framed within a framework of, kind of taking inspiration from people around the world. So it really kind of highlights the idea that we don't have to look at cultural differences as scary, but instead as sort of examples of human possibility. And so, humans around the world do amazing things when they are part of different cultures that don't have the same sort of limitations placed on them. So some of them are like really easy to see, like the Raramuri or the Tarahumara, sometimes they're called, in Mexico, who can run like 400 miles without stopping.
Wow.
It's just,
that's insane.
Yeah, it's things like that we try to highlight and bring up just to make you question a little bit, like, wow, what are the limits of human potential? That kind of thing.
400 miles without stopping?
Yeah.
That is insanity.
Yeah. I mean, what's fun about that is, I first heard about that and I hadn't been running in 12 years. And 3 months later, I was out running like a marathon just by myself, just for fun. Just because, you get into your head, like, I would have never thought I could run a marathon, but then you hear like, well, gosh, some people run 400 miles. Like, surely I can run a marathon. That's no big deal.
Wow. Where can people find you on the World Wide Web?
Oh, probably YouTube or Twitter. My handle is Wesch at both of those, MWESCH. That's probably the easiest way to find me.
Perfect. I'll put all your details in the show notes. And Mike, if you could ask one question to the audience, what would you ask them?
What are you working on, I guess?
And that is all that we have for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, look Mike up. His details are in the show notes. Ask yourself this week, what are you working on? Ask your friends this week, what are they working on? And together, let's own the future.